Charles Adler, 33, a real estate mogul, parked his Porsche at the entrance of the estate. It wasn't often he returned so early, but a last-minute cancelled meeting had brought him home ahead of schedule. His footsteps were light on the gravel path leading to the main door. The mansion's usual silence was broken by voices coming from the kitchen. Something in the tone of those words made him stop. There was an unusual harshness, a cruelty that didn't match the elegance of the surroundings. Charles slowed his pace, moving cautiously down the cold, tiled hallways. "Do you really think someone with your rough hands and that thick southern accent should be serving in a house like this?" The cutting voice of Helen, his 27-year-old wife, echoed off the walls. "Frankly, Josefina, sometimes I wonder why Charles insists on keeping you here." Charles froze in the hallway. Through the half-open door, he saw Helen, impeccable in her designer dress, pointing at a broken teacup on the floor. Before her stood Josefina, 68, head bowed. She had worked for the family for over 2 decades. The old woman's wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she bent to pick up the shards. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Adler. It was an accident," Josefina murmured, her voice thick with humiliation. "An accident? Like everything else you do wrong, isn't it? People like you should be grateful for a decent roof over your head. Back where you're from, you'd be living in a trailer, wouldn't you?" Charles felt his stomach turn. He had known Josefina since childhood. She had worked for his parents, and when he married Helen 3 years ago, he had insisted on bringing her to their new home. Josefina was more than a housekeeper. She was family, or at least she was supposed to be. The grey-haired woman, her face weathered by time, didn't respond to the provocations. There was a dignity in her silence, a strength that contrasted with the apparent fragility of her body, stooped by years of hard work. "Perhaps it's time to find someone more suited to our standards," Helen continued, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her slender wrist. "Someone who understands the value of the things we have here." It was then Charles realized this wasn't an isolated incident. The casualness with which Helen spoke, the resignation in Josefina's eyes, it all pointed to a routine of humiliation that occurred far from his sight. The antique grandfather clock in the hall struck 5 with a solemn chime. Charles took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. He could storm in and stop the scene, but something told him the problem ran deeper. He needed to understand the extent of the situation before he acted. "You broke the cup from our Limoges set," Helen continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you have any idea what that costs?" "Of course you don't. It's probably worth more than everything you've ever owned in your life." Josefina just nodded, carefully gathering the broken pieces. Her eyes, however, did not show complete submission. There was a spark of dignity there that decades of hard work had not managed to extinguish. Charles felt his heart clench. He remembered his own grandmother, a simple woman from rural Virginia who had raised him with values of respect and humility. What would she say if she saw this scene? What would she say about her grandson, who allowed such a thing to happen under his own roof? The mansion, with its crystal chandeliers and expensive art, suddenly felt cold and empty. The true value of a home wasn't in its marble walls or imported furniture, but in the respect shared among the people who lived in it. Charles took a step forward, determined to intervene, when he heard Helen say something that stopped him again. "You know, Josefina, sometimes I wonder what Charles would think of you if he knew how clumsy you are when he isn't around. Perhaps it's time we had a talk about your future in this house." Charles's heart hammered. This wasn't just mistreatment. It was a veiled threat. Helen was using his absence to create an environment of fear and submission. The revelation hit him like a punch. His seemingly perfect marriage hid a side he had refused to see. "I think we've heard enough, don't you?" Charles's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. Helen spun around, her face pale with surprise. Josefina looked up, a mixture of relief and shame in her tired eyes. "Charles, I didn't hear you come in." Helen recovered quickly, forcing a smile. We were just dealing with a small domestic accident. Charles walked into the kitchen with measured steps. His eyes scanned the room, the shards on the floor, Josefina's trembling hands, Helen's artificial smile. Every detail told a story he had refused to see until now. "Josefina," he addressed the old woman gently, "please leave this. Go and rest for a while." "But, sir, the broken cup," Josefina began, hesitant. "It's just a cup," Charles replied, helping her to her feet. "Your dignity is worth infinitely more." When Josefina left, a heavy silence fell between the couple. Helen kept her smile, but her eyes betrayed her apprehension. "Darling, you're making a mountain out of a molehill." She broke a very expensive piece from the set we received as a wedding gift. Charles looked at the woman he shared his life with, Helen Monroe Adler, daughter of a traditional East Coast family, educated in the best schools in Europe, was the personification of elegance. Her delicate face, framed by perfectly styled brown hair, hid a cruelty he had never noticed, or perhaps had never wanted to notice. "How long has this been going on, Helen?" he asked, his voice controlled. "How long has what been going on?" She crossed her arms, defensive. "This treatment, this humiliation. Josefina has worked for my family for over 20 years. She watched me grow up." Helen let out an impatient sigh. "Charles, you don't understand. There are standards to maintain. People like her need to know their place." The phrase landed like a revelation. It wasn't just about a broken cup or a moment of irritation. It was a world view, a belief in superiority based on social class, origin, and appearance. "And what place is that, Helen?" Charles's voice was firmer than he intended. "Beneath us. Less worthy of respect because she wasn't born with privilege?" "Don't be so dramatic." Helen rolled her eyes. "I'm just making sure everything runs perfectly in this house. You're too busy with your business to notice the details." Charles felt the weight of truth in her words. He had been so absorbed in building his empire that he had neglected what was happening inside his own home. Guilt washed over him. "This ends today," he declared. Looking directly into his wife's eyes, "I will not allow this kind of treatment under my roof any more." Helen laughed, a melodious sound that now sounded false to Charles's ears. "And what are you going to do? Fire me as your wife?" "I'm giving you 7 days," Charles replied, surprising himself with the clarity of his decision. 7 days for you to show that you can change, that you can treat people with the respect they deserve, regardless of their background or position. "Or what?" Defiance flashed in Helen's eyes. "Or we will have to reconsider many things about this marriage." The ultimatum hung in the air like a storm cloud. Helen stared at him, first in disbelief, then with a contained rage he had never seen before. "Are you choosing a maid over your own wife?" "I'm choosing dignity over cruelty," Charles replied, feeling a strange calm. "And I sincerely hope you'll do the same." At that moment, Charles's phone rang. It was Anthony, his driver, saying he needed to pick up some documents from the office. The interruption momentarily broke the tension. "We'll continue this conversation later," Charles said, heading for the door. "But I want you to know I was serious. 7 days, Helen." As he left the kitchen, Charles felt the weight of the decision he had just made. It wasn't just about Josefina or Helen. It was about the man he wanted to be, about the values that truly mattered. In the hallway, he found Josefina sitting on a bench, her hands still trembling. Seeing him, the old woman tried to stand, but Charles gently stopped her. "It's all right, Josefina. Things are going to change around here." The old woman's eyes filled with unshed tears. "You don't have to go to any trouble for me." "Sir." "It's no trouble," Charles replied, sitting beside her. "It's the least I can do." The next morning's sun lit the Adler mansion with a clarity that seemed to reveal every shadow. Charles had spent a restless night, tossing and turning while Helen slept, or pretended to sleep on the other side of the bed. The words exchanged in the kitchen echoed in his mind like a persistent bell. He rose before dawn and went to his home office. From there, he could see the garden where Benedict, the 70-year-old gardener, was already working silently among the rose bushes. There was something in the man's dedication that had always touched Charles. The way he treated each plant with respect, as if he were speaking to them in a secret language. "Coffee, sir." Josefina's soft voice broke his thoughts. She was at the door, holding a tray with a steaming cup. "Thank you, Josefina. Please, come in." The woman placed the tray on the mahogany desk and started to leave, but Charles stopped her with a gesture. "I'd like you to sit for a moment, if you don't mind." The surprise on Josefina's face was plain. In 20 years of service, she had rarely been invited to sit in the presence of her employers. "I want to apologize for what happened yesterday," Charles began, watching the woman's wrinkled hands rest tensely on her immaculately white apron. It's not your fault, Mr. Charles." "Yes, it is," he insisted, taking a sip of coffee. "This is my house, and I'm responsible for what happens here. I should have noticed sooner." Josefina lowered her eyes. "Mrs. Adler, she wasn't always like this. In the beginning, when you first married, she was different." Charles nodded thoughtfully. His marriage to Helen had been a whirlwind, an intense 6-month romance that culminated in a lavish wedding for 400 guests. Perhaps he had mistaken passion for love, infatuation for compatibility. "How long has this been going on, Josefina? Please be honest." The old woman hesitated, her hands clutching the fabric of her apron. "It started slowly, sir. First, it was small, impatient remarks, then comments about my accent. It's gotten worse in the last few months. Why didn't you ever say anything to me?" A sad smile crossed her time-worn face. "You seem so happy, so busy with your work. And besides, who would listen to an old housekeeper over the word of the lady of the house?" The truth of that sentence hit Charles like a blow. The world they lived in was built on invisible but powerful hierarchies, where the word of some was worth more than that of others simply because of their social standing. "That's going to change, I promise," he said, with a conviction that surprised them both. "But I need your help. I need to know everything that happened." At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted them. It was Benedict, the gardener, holding his straw hat in his calloused hands. "Excuse me, Mr. Charles, Josefina," he greeted with a respectful nod. "And I brought the roses you asked for the centerpiece." "Thank you, Benedict. You can leave them there," Charles replied, gesturing to a sideboard near the window. The gardener placed the arrangement of red roses where indicated but didn't leave immediately. He seemed to hesitate, as if he wanted to say something more. "Is something wrong, Benedict?" Charles asked. The man exchanged a quick glance with Josefina before answering. "I don't know if I should be meddling, sir, but I heard what happened yesterday." Charles sat up straighter in his chair. "What do you mean?" "I was pruning the roses near the kitchen window," Benedict explained, turning the hat in his fingers. "It wasn't the first time I've heard Mrs. Adler speak that way." A heavy silence fell over the office. Charles looked at his two employees, Josefina, with her eyes downcast, Benedict with an expression of discomfort. They both seemed to be carrying a secret that was too heavy. "Please, Benedict, continue," Charles encouraged. The gardener took a deep breath. "I have a little notebook where I write down the dates for pruning, fertilizing, things like that for the plants, but I also started writing down other things." With slow movements, Benedict took a small, worn-out notebook with a faded blue cover from his shirt pocket. He opened it carefully and held it out to Charles. "Here, sir. I started noting the dates and what I heard. It's not for gossip, you understand. It's just that it pained me to see Josefina suffering in silence." Charles took the notebook with trembling hands. The pages were filled with simple but legible handwriting, dates, times and phrases, cruel words, systematic humiliations, veiled threats, all meticulously recorded by the calloused hand of a man who had spent his life caring for plants, but who also cared about people. "Benedict—" Charles couldn't finish the sentence, emotion tightening his throat. I know I shouldn't have gotten involved. The gardener lowered his eyes. But my mother, God rest her soul, always said that staying silent in the face of cruelty is almost as bad as committing it yourself. Charles flipped through the notebook, feeling a mix of gratitude and shame. Gratitude for Benedict's gesture, shame for having been so blind. This is very valuable, he finally said, handing the notebook back. I'd like to hold on to this for a while, if you'll allow me. Benedict nodded. Of course, sir. I only ask that you protect Josefina. She's like a sister to me. When the gardener left, Charles turned back to Josefina, who remained seated in silence, her hands now trembling slightly. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Charles asked, his voice soft. Josefina raised her eyes, revealing a dignity that decades of service had not diminished. Do you remember your grandmother, Eleanor? Charles smiled at the mention of the grandmother who had raised him after his parents' untimely death. Of course I do. She always told me, Josefina, our worth isn't in what others think of us, but in what we know to be true in our hearts. I know who I am. Mr. Charles, Mrs. Adler's words hurt, but they don't change who I am. The simplicity of that wisdom touched Charles deeply. He remembered his grandmother, a strong woman who had managed the family business after being widowed young, always treating everyone with the same respect, regardless of their social standing. My grandmother would be proud of you, Josefina, and ashamed of me for letting this happen. You didn't know. Josefina tried to console him. But I should have, Charles replied, standing up. And now that I know, things are going to change. At that moment, they heard the click of high heels in the hallway. Helen appeared at the door, impeccable in a navy blue dress, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Am I interrupting something? She asked, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Josefina and I were just talking, Charles replied, keeping his voice calm. Helen shot a cold glance at the housekeeper. I imagine so, Josefina. Is breakfast ready? I'll see to it right away, ma'am, Josefina replied, rising quickly. That won't be necessary, Charles intervened. Josefina was helping me with something important. Why don't we have breakfast together on the terrace? It's a beautiful day. The suggestion caught both women by surprise. Helen frowned but quickly recomposed her expression. Of course, darling. As you wish. As they walked to the terrace, Charles felt the weight of Benedict's notebook in his shirt pocket. Those simple pages contained more truth about his home than he had managed to see in 3 years of marriage. Breakfast passed in a tense silence, broken only by superficial comments about the weather or the day's appointments. Helen maintained a polite smile, but her eyes betrayed a growing unease. About yesterday, she began, as they finished eating. Not here, Charles interrupted, gesturing discreetly towards the staff moving about the house. Let's talk in the office. Once they were alone in the office, Helen dropped her mask of serenity. Are you really taking this seriously? This whole 7-day thing? I am, Charles confirmed, sitting behind his desk, and I have more information now than I did yesterday. What kind of information? Helen's tone was defiant, but there was a subtle tremor in her voice. Charles placed Benedict's notebook on the desk, the kind that makes me question not only how you treat our staff, but what kind of person you really are. Helen looked at the blue notebook with suspicion. What is that? A record, Charles replied, opening it to the first page. Dates, times, exact words. Benedict has sharp ears and an even sharper sense of justice. Helen's face paled slightly, but she maintained her composure. You're going to believe the scribblings of a barely literate gardener over your own wife. The cruelty of that sentence confirmed everything Charles was beginning to realize about the woman he had married. It wasn't just a matter of a bad mood or excessive demands. It was a worldview founded on a belief in superiority. Benedict may not have degrees hanging on his wall, Helen, but he has something you seem to lack: humanity. Helen crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "You're being ridiculous. Demanding excellence from staff is part of running a house of this stature." "Excellence, yes. Humiliation, no." Charles closed the notebook with a firm gesture. 7 days, and Helen, 7 days to show you can change. And what if I refuse to play this childish game? Charles faced her with a seriousness he had never shown before. Then we will have to reconsider many aspects of our life together." The veiled threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Helen studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge if he was truly serious. "You wouldn't throw away our marriage over a housekeeper." "This isn't just about Josefina," Charles replied, standing. "This is about the values I want to stand for, the kind of man I want to be." Helen let out a dry laugh. How moving. The millionaire discovers his social conscience. "Perhaps it's about time," Charles replied, heading for the door. "I have a meeting in half an hour. We'll continue this conversation later." As he left the office, Charles felt a mix of determination and apprehension. The confrontation with Helen was just the beginning of a battle that promised to be difficult. But something inside him had shifted, a certainty that he was on the right path, even if it was painful. In the hallway, he found Josefina carrying a stack of clean towels. The woman stopped when she saw him, a worried look on her wrinkled face. "Is everything all right, Mr. Charles?" He smiled, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "It will be Josefina, I promise." For the next 2 days, a strange peace settled over the mansion. Helen seemed to have backed off, treating the staff with a cold politeness, but without the previous humiliations. Charles remained vigilant, dividing his time between his corporate office and his home, observing every interaction. On the morning of the 3rd day, while having coffee on the terrace, Charles was surprised by the arrival of Mariana, Helen's younger sister. As elegant as her sister, but with a more genuine smile, Mariana was an architect and rarely visited the estate. "What a pleasant surprise," Charles commented, rising to greet her. "Helen called me yesterday," Mariana explained, accepting the cup of coffee Josefina offered her with a warm, "Thank you." "She said she needed my opinion on some renovations for the house." Charles frowned, confused. He knew of no renovation plans. "What kind of renovations?" "I'm not sure." Helen was vague on the phone. At that moment, Helen appeared on the terrace, radiant in an emerald green dress. "Mariana, I'm so glad you made it." "Shall we take a walk through the garden? I want to show you a few ideas." Two sisters were off, chatting animatedly. Charles watched them with a growing sense of suspicion. Helen was up to something, and Mariana's presence was part of her plan. Later that day, while reviewing some contracts in his office, Charles heard raised voices coming from the living room. He immediately recognized Helen's voice, followed by a sound that alarmed him, Josefina's stifled sobs. He got up quickly and went to the living room. He walked in on a disturbing scene. Helen, standing, was gesturing accusingly at Josefina, who was holding a broken picture frame. Mariana was watching the scene with obvious discomfort. "What's going on in here?" Charles asked, his voice cutting through the tense air. Helen turned to him, her face a mask of indignation. "Josefina broke the silver picture frame we received as a wedding gift. The one with our photo in Greece." Charles looked at Josefina, whose hands were trembling visibly. "Was it an accident, Josefina?" Before the old woman could answer, Helen intervened. "Of course she'll say it was an accident, but Mariana saw the whole thing, didn't you, Marie?" Mariana seemed startled to be put on the spot. "I was just coming into the room when I heard the crash. I didn't see exactly how it happened. But you heard what Josefina said afterwards, didn't you?" Helen pressed. A heavy silence fell over the room. Charles saw Helen's game. She was trying to use her sister as a witness, creating a situation that would put Josefina in a difficult position. "Josefina," Charles addressed the housekeeper directly, "please tell me what happened." The old woman took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "When I was dusting the shelf and I bumped the frame. It was an accident, I swear to God." "And after," Helen pressed, "what did you say after, Josefina?" Josefina lowered her eyes. I may have muttered something. She said, "Good riddance," Helen accused, triumphant. Mariana heard it. "Didn't you, Mary?" All eyes turned to Mariana, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I heard something, but I'm not sure what it was." Charles saw the manipulation. Helen was using her sister's presence to create a narrative that would damage Josefina, trying to prove that the housekeeper was acting with ill intent. "The frame can be replaced," Charles said, keeping his voice calm. "There's no need for such drama over an object." "It's not about the object, Charles," Helen retorted, her eyes flashing with indignation. "It's about respect, about intent." Charles looked at Josefina, then at Mariana, and finally at Helen. The entire situation felt orchestrated, a carefully laid trap. "Mariana, could you give us a moment, please?" Charles asked. When his sister-in-law had left, Charles turned to Helen. "Is this part of your plan, using your sister to create situations that put Josefina in a bad light?" Helen feigned surprise. "What are you talking about?" "It was an accident that happened right in front of Mariana. It's not my fault she was here." "Josefina," Charles said to the housekeeper, "could you leave us alone, please? And don't worry about the frame." When they were alone, Charles faced his wife with a grave expression. 3 days, Helen, 3 of the 7 I promised. And instead of showing change, you're manufacturing situations to manipulate the narrative." Helen held Charles's gaze, a cold smile on her lips. "You're seeing conspiracies where there's only a careless, resentful maid. I've known Josefina for 20 years. She's not resentful. People change, Charles. Perhaps she felt empowered after you took her side." Charles shook his head, incredulous at his wife's capacity for manipulation. "I'm not taking sides. I'm defending the basic respect that every human being deserves." "How noble," Helen sneered. "The defender of the downtrodden." At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted their argument. It was Mariana, looking embarrassed. "Sorry to interrupt, but I need to talk to you both." Charles gestured for her to enter. Mariana closed the door behind her and took a deep breath before speaking. "Helen, I can't be a part of this," she said, facing her sister. "You brought me here under a false pretense about renovations, and now you're trying to use me to hurt Josefina." Helen turned pale. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Mariana continued, her voice firm. "Before Charles came in, you asked me to confirm that I'd heard Josefina say, 'Good riddance,' even though you know I heard no such thing." Charles looked from one sister to the other, the revelation confirming his suspicions. Helen had planned it all: Mariana's visit, the incident with the frame, the accusation against Josefina. "This is ridiculous." Helen tried to defend herself, but her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Mariana is confused." "I'm not confused," Mariana shot back. "And I'm not going to lie to help you mistreat an old woman who has always been kind to me. Remember when I used to spend summers here as a teenager? Josefina always saved those cinnamon cookies I loved." Helen crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "You were always too sentimental, Marie. And you were always too calculating," Mariana replied, turning to Charles. "I'm sorry about this, Charles. I didn't know I was being used." When Mariana left, a heavy silence fell between the couple. Charles felt a mix of disappointment and anger growing inside him. "That was low, even for the new standards I'm discovering in you," he said finally. Helen didn't answer right away. For a brief moment, Charles saw something in her eyes, not remorse, but perhaps the realization that she had gone too far. "You don't understand the pressure," she said at last, her voice softer. "To maintain this house, this lifestyle, to be the perfect wife of the successful businessman, does that justify humiliating people who work for us?" "It's not about humiliation." Helen looked away. "It's about control, about keeping everything running perfectly." Charles realized they were getting to the heart of the matter. It wasn't just gratuitous cruelty. There was something deeper in Helen's need to exert power over others. "No one expects perfection, Helen. I certainly don't." "The world does," she replied, an unusual vulnerability in her voice. "Don't you see the looks when we go out? The expectations. Charles Adler's wife must be flawless in everything." For a moment, Charles felt a pang of compassion. Helen lived under pressures he had perhaps never fully understood, but that didn't justify her behavior. "That's no excuse for treating people as if they are inferior," he said softly. "No one in this house is less worthy of respect than we are." Helen looked at him, something shifting in her expression. "You really believe that, don't you? It's not just a pose." "I do. My grandmother taught me that a person's character isn't measured by what they have, but by how they treat those who can offer them nothing in return." A reflective silence fell between them. Charles hoped that maybe, finally, he had reached something inside Helen, but the moment passed, and the mask of coldness returned to her face. "4 days," Helen said, standing up. "I still have 4 days, don't I?" In the days that followed, a strange truce settled over the mansion. Helen kept her distance from Josefina and the other staff, treating them with a formal politeness that, if not warm, was at least not cruel. Charles divided his time between his office and the house, alert to any sign that things might deteriorate. On the morning of the 6th day, Charles was surprised to find Josefina in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a smile on her face, something he hadn't seen in weeks. "Good morning, Josefina. You seem well today." The old woman smiled, placing a cup of fresh coffee in front of him. "Good morning, Mr. Charles. I am well. Yes, Mrs. Adler came to speak with me last night." Charles raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Helen spoke with you? About what?" "She apologized," Josefina replied, her voice thick with emotion. "She said she's been under a lot of pressure, but that it doesn't justify the way she treated me." The news took Charles by surprise. Helen apologizing. It seemed almost unbelievable after everything that had happened. "Do you believe she was sincere?" Josefina reflected for a moment before answering. "I can't say for sure, sir, but it was a start. And this morning she even asked about my granddaughter, who's due soon." Charles felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Helen was really trying to change. Maybe the ultimatum had worked better than he'd expected. Later that day, returning from a meeting, Charles found Helen in the garden, talking with Benedict about the roses. The scene was so unusual that he stopped to watch from a distance. Helen seemed genuinely interested in what the gardener was saying, jotting something down in a small notepad. When Benedict moved on, Charles approached his wife. "Developing an interest in gardening." Helen smiled, tucking the notepad into her bag. "Benedict knows these plants better than any landscaper we've ever hired. I thought I could learn something." Charles studied his wife's face, searching for signs of falsehood, but found none. "I heard you spoke with Josefina last night." "Yes." Helen looked away towards the roses. "I realized you were right. She didn't deserve to be treated that way." "What brought about this change?" Helen hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "After Mariana left, I kept thinking about the kind of person I'm becoming. I wasn't like this before, you know. When we first met, I wasn't like this." Charles nodded, remembering the woman he had fallen in love with. Smart, ambitious, but also kind and thoughtful. Somewhere along the way, something had changed. "What happened to us, Helen?" She looked at the imposing mansion, then at the meticulously kept garden. "And I think we got lost in all of this. The perfect house, the social events, the appearances. We forgot what really matters." It was the first time in a long while that Charles felt he was truly talking to his wife, not the social persona she had constructed. "There's still time for us to find our way back," he said, gently touching her arm. Helen smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her eyes. "I hope so." That evening, during dinner, Helen surprised everyone by inviting Josefina to sit at the table with them. The old woman, embarrassed, tried to refuse, but Helen insisted. "Please, Josefina, it would be an honor." Hesitantly, The housekeeper sat down, her wrinkled hands resting tensely in her lap. Charles watched the scene with a mixture of surprise and emotion. "Josefina," Helen began, personally pouring a little wine into the old woman's glass. "Charles told me you've worked for his family for over 20 years. Yes, ma'am. I started when Mr. Charles was just a boy." "You must have a lot of stories to tell," Helen commented, with genuine interest. And so, over dinner, Josefina shared memories of a teenage Charles, of his grandmother Eleanor, of Christmases and birthdays past. Helen listened attentively, asking questions, laughing at the funny stories. It was as if an invisible barrier had been torn down, allowing humanity to flow where before there had only been hierarchy. When Josefina retired to rest, Charles looked at Helen with admiration. "That was unexpected." "In a good way, I hope," she replied with a shy smile. "In the best way possible." That night, for the first time in weeks, they slept in each other's arms, like in the early days of their marriage. Charles fell asleep with the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they had found a new beginning. The morning of the 7th day dawned with a different kind of light. Charles awoke, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. Beside him, Helen was still asleep, her face serene, free of the mask of perfection she usually wore even in her sleep. He rose quietly and went out to the terrace. The garden glowed under the rising sun. Benedict's rose bushes showing buds that promised exuberant blooms. There was a simple beauty in the scene that he rarely allowed himself to appreciate, always too busy with spreadsheets, meetings and deals. "Coffee, sir." Josefina's voice brought him back to the present. "Thank you, Josefina." Charles accepted the cup, noticing the genuine smile on the old woman's face. "You seem well today." "I am," she confirmed, straightening her immaculate white apron. "It's been a long time since I felt so at peace in this house." Charles nodded, understanding the feeling perfectly. "Things are changing, aren't they?" "Thanks to you, sir," Josefina replied, gratitude in her eyes. "What you did for us, it's priceless. I did nothing more than what I should have done a long time ago." Josefina hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but was held back by years of habit of keeping to her place. "You can speak freely, Josefina," Charles encouraged. "There are no more barriers between us." The old woman took a deep breath. "It's about Mrs. Adler. I think she's really trying to change. Last night, after you went to sleep, she came to my room." Charles raised his eyebrows, surprised. "And what did she want?" "She showed me some old photos of her family from when she was a child." Josefina smiled at the memory. She told me her mother was very strict, that nothing she ever did was good enough. I think she was trying to explain to me, not justify, but explain why she sometimes treats people the way she does." Charles felt a pang of compassion. Helen rarely spoke of her childhood, and he knew very little about the dynamics of her family of origin. "She cried, you know," Josefina continued. "She said she's afraid of not being good enough, of losing all of this." The old woman made a gesture encompassing the mansion. "I think behind all that posturing, there's a scared little girl." The observation, coming from someone who had been the target of Helen's cruelty, demonstrated a wisdom and compassion that touched Charles deeply. "You are an extraordinary woman, Josefina." The old woman blushed at the compliment. "I've just lived long enough to know that people are rarely just what they appear to be." At that moment, Helen appeared on the terrace, wearing a blue silk robe, her hair loose on her shoulders, a softer, more natural version of the always impeccable woman the world knew. "Good morning," she greeted, with a shy smile. "May I join you?" "Of course," Charles replied, pulling a chair out for her. Josefina served coffee for Helen, who thanked her with a genuine "thank you." The old woman then discreetly withdrew, leaving the couple alone. "It's the 7th day," Helen commented, looking out at the garden. Charles nodded. "It is. Do you think I passed the test?" There was a vulnerability in her voice, a rare thing from Helen. "It wasn't a test. Charles replied gently. It was an opportunity for both of us. Helen took a sip of coffee, thoughtful. You know, last night, talking with Josefina, I realized something. I've spent so much time worrying about being the perfect wife of the successful businessman that I forgot to just be human. You don't have to be perfect, Helen. You never did. She smiled, a sad but genuine smile. My mother used to say otherwise. A Monroe never shows weakness, never makes mistakes, is never less than exceptional. I grew up believing that any flaw would be unforgivable. Charles took his wife's hand in his. It was the first time she had spoken so openly about her childhood, about the pressures that had shaped who she had become. We're not in the Monroe house now, he said softly. We're building our own home with our own values. Helen squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I want to be a part of that. I want to be better. In that moment, something broke and was rebuilt between them. Not an empty promise, but a genuine commitment to change. The rest of the day passed with a tranquility not seen in the Adler mansion for a long time. Helen spent the morning helping Benedict in the garden, learning about the different species of roses he cultivated with such care. Charles watched from a distance, marveling at the transformation. In the afternoon, a surprise, Helen organized a small luncheon on the terrace and invited all the household staff, Josefina, Benedict, Anthony the driver, Maria the cook, and the others. Initially awkward with the unusual invitation, they gradually relaxed, sharing stories and laughter. I wanted to thank all of you, Helen said, as the meal was winding down. Her voice, usually firm and controlled, trembled slightly with restrained emotion. Not just for the work you do, but for the patience you've had with me. A respectful silence fell over the group. No one had expected these words from the ever-composed lady of the house. This mansion is impressive, Helen continued, looking around, but I've realized it's not the marble walls or the crystal chandeliers that make it a home. It's you, all of you. Charles watched the scene, his heart full. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, not the cold, calculating socialite, but the Helen, capable of vulnerability and growth. Josefina, sitting beside Benedict, had tears in her eyes. The gardener, normally so reserved, was smiling openly, his straw hat resting on his knees. From today on, Helen went on, I want this house to be different, a place where everyone is respected, where everyone's dignity is valued. When the luncheon ended and the staff returned to their duties, Charles approached his wife, who remained on the terrace, contemplating the garden. That was very special, he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. Helen leaned her head against his chest. It was the least I could do. A first step, an important one. They stood like that for a moment, in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Do you know what else I learned in these 7 days? Helen asked, her voice soft. What? That true strength isn't in controlling others, but in controlling yourself, in choosing to be kind when it would be easier to be cruel. Charles kissed the top of her head, feeling a wave of love and pride. My grandmother used to say something similar, that true nobility doesn't come from a name or a fortune, but from the choices we make every day. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Helen smiled. And I wish I had known her better. She would have liked the Helen I'm seeing today. That night, after dinner, Charles found Josefina in the kitchen, organizing the last few things before retiring. May I speak with you for a moment? He asked, gesturing to the small table in the corner. Josefina nodded, drying her hands on her apron before sitting down. Of course, Mr. Charles. Charles took an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. I wanted to give you this personally. The old woman looked at the envelope with curiosity. What is it? Open it, Charles encouraged. With trembling fingers, Josefina opened the envelope and pulled out an official document. Her eyes scanned the lines, widening in surprise. Is this "The deed to a condo on the Upper East Side," Charles confirmed. "It's in your name, Josefina. It's yours." The old woman brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "But why?" "For 20 years of dedication, for helping to raise the man I am today, for your dignity and wisdom." Charles smiled, moved. "And because you deserve to have your own home, for whenever you decide it's time to rest." Silent tears streamed down Josefina's wrinkled face. "I don't know what to say, son." "You don't have to say anything, but I want you to know you will always have a place here, if you want it. This is your home, too." Josefina held Charles's hands in her own, calloused by decades of work. "You know what makes me happiest? It's not the condo, though it's a blessing I never imagined I'd receive. It's seeing the man you've become. Your grandmother would be so proud." Charles felt his own emotions tighten his throat. "Thank you, Josefina, for everything." When he returned to their bedroom, he found Helen sitting on the bed, flipping through an old photo album. "What are you looking at?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Our wedding," she replied, showing a photo of the two of them at the ceremony. "Look how happy we were." Charles studied the image. He in an impeccable suit, Helen radiant in her wedding gown, both smiling at the future they imagined building together. "We can be that happy again," he said. "Maybe even happier." Helen closed the album and looked at him seriously. "These 7 days, they changed everything, didn't they? For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better." She hesitated, as if choosing her next words carefully. "I gave the downtown condo to Benedict." Charles raised his eyebrows, surprised. "The one we use for guests?" Helen nodded. "He has a daughter with 2 grandsons in Queens. They live so far away. With the condo, they can be closer. And the children can go to better schools." The unexpected generosity touched Charles deeply. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a symbol of genuine transformation. "That's wonderful, Helen." "I learned from you," she smiled, touching his face tenderly, "that our true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we share." That night, they fell asleep in each other's arms, certain that they had found something far more valuable than any material fortune. They had rediscovered the humanity that bound them, not just to each other, but to everyone around them. In the weeks that followed, the Adler mansion was transformed. Not in its physical structure, the marble walls were still there, as were the crystal chandeliers and valuable art. The change was more subtle, but infinitely more significant. It was in the atmosphere, in the way people related to one another, in the respect that flowed in all directions. Helen surprised everyone by enrolling in a social work course. "I want to better understand the realities I've never had to face," she explained to Charles. "I want to use our resources to make a difference in people's lives." Charles, in turn, implemented changes in his companies, better conditions for employees, training programs, opportunities for people from underserved communities. The Adler empire continued to grow, but now with a purpose beyond profit. Josefina decided to continue working at the mansion, but in a new role, no longer as a maid, but as a kind of house manager and mentor. Her knowledge of the house and the family was invaluable, and now it was valued as it deserved. On a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after that fateful day when Charles came home early, the family gathered in the garden for a special lunch. Not just Charles and Helen, but everyone who was part of that house: Josefina, Benedict, the other staff members and their families. Under the shade of a centennial oak tree, seated at a long table decorated with roses from the garden, they shared not just a meal, but stories, laughter, and the certainty that they had built something rare and precious. A community based on mutual respect. Charles watched the scene, his heart full. Helen, beside him, looked more beautiful than ever, not for the perfection of her appearance, but for the light that now radiated from within. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing his contemplative gaze. "About how much life can change in 7 days," he replied, smiling, about how small choices can transform everything. Helen squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with genuine happiness. You know what Josefina told me the other day? That true wealth isn't kept in safes, but in the hearts of the people we touch. Charles looked at the table, at those smiling faces that formed his extended family. She's right, as always. Then we are very rich, Helen concluded, resting her head on his shoulder. And they were indeed, not because of the imposing mansion or the robust bank accounts, but because of the dignity they had learned to recognize and value in themselves and in every person who crossed their path. The afternoon stretched on slowly, golden and perfect. In the sky, white clouds drew shapes that seemed like promises of even better days to come. And under the old oak tree, a family defined not by blood, but by choice and respect, celebrated the most valuable of discoveries. That true greatness lies not in power over others, but in the power to transform oneself. 3 years later, the late afternoon sun bathed the garden of the Adler mansion in a golden light, creating long shadows among the rose bushes that Benedict cultivated with such care. Seated on a wooden bench under the oak tree, Josefina watched the children running across the lawn, their laughter echoing like music. At 71, Josefina still had the straight posture and attentive gaze that had always characterized her. Her hair, now completely white, was styled in a simple bun, and her hands, though marked by time and work, moved nimbly as she knitted a small blue sweater. "Is it almost ready?" Helen's voice sounded behind her, gentle and warm. Josefina smiled, holding up her knitting for the other to see. "Just a few more stitches. Do you think it will fit?" Helen sat beside the old woman, her 6-month pregnant belly forming a soft curve under her light dress. "It will be perfect." "Josefina, thank you." The two women sat in silence for a moment, watching the children, the staff's children, and some from a community project the Adler Foundation had started in the neighboring town. Among them, a boy of about 5 stood out, with brown skin and lively eyes, leading a game of tag. "Miguel looks more like his father every day," Josefina commented, watching Benedict's grandson. Helen nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "He has the same wisdom in his eyes, and the same passion for plants. Charles said he found him yesterday helping his grandfather prune the roses." "That boy has a green thumb," Josefina agreed. "Benedict says he's never seen someone so young understand so much about plants." The sound of an approaching car interrupted their conversation. Moments later, Charles appeared in the garden, his impeccable suit contrasting with his relaxed smile. Upon seeing him, the children ran in his direction, surrounding him with demands for attention and games. "Easy, easy," Charles laughed, crouching down to their level. "There's time for everyone, I promise." Helen watched the scene with eyes shining with emotion. The man she had known years ago, focused on business, sometimes distant, had transformed into someone who knew how to balance professional success with the truly important things in life. "He's going to be a wonderful father," Josefina commented, following Helen's gaze. "He will," Helen agreed, stroking her belly. "Our son is lucky." After playing with the children for a bit, Charles walked over to the bench where the two women were sitting. He kissed Helen tenderly and sat down next to Josefina. "How was your day, Josefina?" he asked, with genuine interest. The old woman smiled. "Quiet. I helped in the kitchen this morning. I checked on the new curtains that arrived, and now I'm finishing this little sweater for your son. It's going to be beautiful," Charles said, touching the knitting with admiration. "He'll be the best-dressed baby in New York, thanks to you." Josefina blushed at the compliment. Even after 3 years of the changed dynamics in the house, she was still surprised by the respect and affection she received from the Adler family. "I brought something for you," Charles continued, taking an envelope from his inner jacket pocket. "It arrived at the office today." Josefina took the envelope with curiosity. As she opened it, her eyes widened in surprise. "Is this your ticket to Tennessee?" Charles confirmed. To visit your sister like you wanted. Round trip for a 1-month stay. And don't worry about a thing here. Everything will be taken care of in your absence. Silent tears streamed down Josefina's wrinkled face. It's been 15 years since I've seen my sister. She doesn't even know my great-grandchildren. Now she will. Helen smiled, holding the old woman's hand. And you can show her all the pictures we took last Christmas. At that moment, Benedict approached, his ever-present straw hat in his hands. At 73, he still maintained the straight posture and keen eyes of someone who had spent his life watching the silent growth of plants. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and calm. "The white roses we planted last month are starting to bloom. I thought you might like to see them." The four of them walked together to a more distant flower bed, where delicate white roses were blooming among green foliage. Helen had personally chosen that variety after months of studying gardening with Benedict. "They're perfect," Helen murmured, gently touching one of the flowers. "Exactly as I imagined for the baby's room. Nature always delivers what it promises when treated with respect," said Benedict, with the simple wisdom of one who has spent a lifetime observing cycles of growth and renewal. Charles smiled, recognizing the profound truth in those words. It wasn't just about plants, it was about relationships, about life itself. When you cultivate with care and respect, the results come naturally. "We'll use these roses to decorate the nursery," Helen decided, inspired. "And for the christening too, when the time comes." As they walked back to the house, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The mansion, imposing against this backdrop, seemed different now, not just a structure of marble and glass, but a true home, where every person's value was recognized. On the terrace, the table was being set for dinner, not in the formal dining room, with its long mahogany table and austere chairs, but outdoors, where everyone could enjoy the soft evening breeze. "I'm going to help in the kitchen," Josefina announced, putting her knitting in her bag. "Me too," Helen said, to everyone's surprise. Charles watched the two women walk towards the kitchen together, the old woman from a humble background and the socialite raised in privilege, now united by a mutual respect that transcended social barriers. Anyone seeing them today would never imagine the tension that had existed between them 3 years ago. "You seem thoughtful, sir," commented Benedict, who had remained by Charles's side. "I'm just grateful," Charles replied, "for everything that happened, even the difficult parts." The gardener nodded, understanding. "You know what I've learned in 70 years of growing things? Sometimes a plant needs a hard pruning to produce the most beautiful flowers." Charles smiled at the metaphor. "You're a wise man, Benedict." "No, sir, I've just lived long enough to see that everything has its season, sorrow and joy, loss and gain." The old man looked out at the garden, where his grandson Miguel was still playing with the other children. "What matters is what we do with what life gives us." Later, during dinner, Charles watched the people gathered around the table. Helen, radiant in her pregnancy, chatted animatedly with Maria, the cook, about recipes for babies. Josefina proudly showed photos of her great-grandchildren to Anthony, the driver. Benedict patiently explained to Miguel how to tell when a rose was ready to be picked. It was a scene that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. Employers and employees sharing not just a meal, but their lives, their stories, their dreams. "A toast," Charles announced, raising his glass. Everyone turned to him expectantly. "To the family we've built together, not the one given to us by blood, but the one we choose with our hearts." "To family," they replied in unison, glasses raised under the starry sky. Helen, sitting next to Charles, squeezed his hand under the table. Her eyes, misty with emotion, said more than any words could express. Later, when everyone had retired and the mansion was quiet, Charles and Helen walked hand in hand through the garden, lit only by the full moon. Do you ever wonder what our life would be like if you hadn't come home early that day? Helen asked, her voice soft in the quiet night. Charles thought for a moment. We'd probably still be living in separate worlds. Even while sharing the same house, me absorbed in my business, you in your social obligations. And Josefina, she might have left, unable to bear the treatment. Or worse, she might have stayed, believing she deserved nothing better. Helen shuddered at the possibility. It's frightening to think of the person I was becoming. What's important is who you chose to be, Charles replied, kissing her forehead gently. We all have that choice. Every day. They stopped before the bed of white roses, which shone almost ethereally in the moonlight. Helen carefully bent down, caressing her prominent belly, and touched one of the flowers. I want our son to grow up understanding this, she said. That a person's true worth isn't in what they own, but in the respect they show for others. That true strength isn't in dominating, but in uplifting. He will learn, Charles assured her. They're not just from our words, but from our example, and from the example of people like Josefina and Benedict. Helen smiled, imagining the future they would build for this new life growing inside her, a future where dignity and respect were not abstract concepts, but daily practices. You know what Josefina told me today, while we were preparing dinner? Helen asked. What? She said that sometimes the greatest miracles happen in the most unexpected moments. That day, when you came home early and heard how I treated her, was the beginning of a miracle for all of us. Charles nodded thoughtfully. She's right. It was a turning point. But the real miracle, Helen continued, wasn't just that moment. It was every choice we made after, every time we chose compassion over indifference, respect over arrogance, love over fear. They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the stars that dotted the dark sky. The night was perfectly still, as if the universe itself had paused to acknowledge the beauty of that moment. Our son will be born into a home full of love, Charles said finally, placing his hand over Helen's on her belly. And respect, she added. The kind of respect that recognizes the dignity in every person, regardless of their origin or position. As if in reply, the baby gave a little kick, making them both smile at the coincidence. He agrees, Helen laughed. They walked slowly back to the house, arms linked, steps in sync. The mansion, once just a symbol of status and wealth, now represented something far more valuable, a space where human dignity was honored above all else. In the room that would be the baby's, they paused to admire the preparations. A light wood crib, handcrafted by a local carpenter, soft curtains that Helen had chosen personally, a delicate mobile that Josefina had knitted with her skillful hands. Perfect, Helen murmured, imagining her son in that welcoming space. Almost perfect, Charles corrected, smiling. Tomorrow I'll bring in some of those white roses to complete it. That night, as the Adler mansion rested under the starry sky, each of its inhabitants, from the owners to the staff, slept with the certainty that they had built something rare and precious, a place where mutual respect was not the exception, but the fundamental rule. And in the garden, the white roses continued to bloom in the moonlight, silent symbols that with care and respect, even the most unlikely transformations can blossom into unexpected beauty. End of story.